So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's ICG webinar, Designing and Delivering Hybrid Events, a Taster. I'm Lucy Wernick, the ICG Manager. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, go back to the first one. For today's webinar, we are delighted to welcome Orla Cronin, a research psychologist, facilitator, trainer and consultant. Orla was an active member of the ICG for several years, some of you may know her, until her focus of her business changed. In over 20 years of facilitating, Orla has developed a broad toolkit of live and virtual facilitation methods. She has provided training in both face-to-face and virtual facilitation since 2015. Before I hand over to Orla, here are some more events, if you wouldn't mind, Orla.
Sorry.
Thank you.
It comes.
We've got planned for you over the summer, so there's lots going on. Don't forget that we offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars and online events. So if you're interested in that, please get in touch with me. Next slide, over to Orla. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lucy. And thank you for that lovely introduction. It's funny hearing your story told by somebody else. I kind of realize it's a bit complicated and fragmented, but never mind. It's lovely to see you all. It's lovely to be back. I was a really keen and really active member of the ICG for quite some time. And I only left because I wasn't doing anything even vaguely resembling market research anymore. But it was the model that I've kept in mind for a peer support group for many years. So I'm really glad to be back and offer a contribution. Just for those of you who've just arrived, we're saying hello in the chat to each other, saying where we're based. Please also continue to use the chat as we go forward. Also, although this is billed as a webinar, this is interactive. It's not quite a workshop, but it's certainly not a death by PowerPoint. I'll be really disappointed if I don't get some so-called interruptions. Comments, questions, arguments are always really good as well. So feel free to disagree with anything I might say. In terms of what we're covering, Danny is from my home city. That's great. Thanks, Danny. I'm a Cork woman, born but not unfortunately bred. Anyway, what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by hybrid, because one of the things, I was trying to find the quote, hybrid meetings can be unique in their complexity, but one of the things we're trying to do is find some frames to help you decomplexificate them. So we'll talk a bit about definitions. We're going to have a chance to meet each other because after all, you are part of a very big peer group. It's quite nice to say hi. So we will have a short breakout session to talk about, what would success look like for you? Which really can help to really focus on what your needs might be. We'll talk then a bit about what we're trying to achieve or what I'm trying to achieve as a facilitator in a great hybrid event. And we'll talk about some tools and methods. And then if we have time, which we may not, we might have a final breakout and close up at noon. Now, before I go climbing into all the stuff, I've realized already several times I've talked about facilitating and designing hybrid events. I'm really aware that in the ICG, very often you may turn up as participants in events, potentially in debriefs, or you may be holding space where you have potentially a face-to-face focus group with some clients zooming in or beaming in, or vice versa. So I realize that you may not always have full control over the hybrid events that you end up in, but I'm really hoping that some of these frames will help you ask the questions so that you don't end up in one of these accidental last-minute hybrids, which can be quite unsatisfactory. So I'd love to hear a bit more from you as we go along or in the chat about whether you're designing these events yourself or whether you're being zoomed in as a speaker or something in between. Okay, in terms of how we're going to conduct ourselves for the next hour, interact. I think I've already made that really clear. Questions and comments in chat, but please do also raise your Zoom hand to speak. I'll see that in the participant list. I won't see it if you do it in your window, I'm afraid. So please just raise your Zoom hand. You can find that down in the in your Zoom toolbar, depending on where you've got that sitting. Say your name when you speak. It's quite useful. We start to then sort of imprint names into accents. And if we ask you to do anything, mainly Mentimeter, we'll paste that link in the chat. So make sure that you can find the chat. If you need any tech support, do feel free to private message Lucy. Obviously, in an hour, there's a finite amount we can do. And if you haven't heard the question, you're not sure what we're supposed to be doing, ask us in chat. Don't be embarrassed. So first of all, I want to do some definitions because I believe firmly that language shapes thought, and if we start clarifying what we mean, it helps us to communicate, but it also helps us to tidy up some of these really messy hybrid events. So the language we've come up with, I work with a couple of other colleagues whose logos are on this screen behind me. We've come up with the term roomies, who are people who are co-located in a space or in a hub. And then Zoomies, because we're mainly using Zoom and it rhymes with the roomies, we call the people who are joining independently and remotely are Zoomies. And then the facilitator is basically that host or that person who is in charge of pulling that meeting together. And there may be many different roles involved in that, and there may be more than one of them, but basically that there is somebody who has some authority over the meeting. Now, we have had on several occasions objectives to the depersonalization of roomies and Zoomies. So please just roll with it for the sake of clarity. And you could consider yourself what words you might use. The crucial thing I want to clarify with that language is that what we need to avoid from the very outset is starting to talk about the live people and everything else and everybody else, or the in-person people and everybody else, because it immediately starts to differentiate those people in quite an unhelpful way. What we need to think about is everybody being live, everybody being in person, some people being co-located and some people being remote. And it really helps to then clarify, well, how do you embrace everybody's personhood in that situation? Now, I hope you can see this. It looks a little bit small for me, but I've said already that hybrids can be extremely complex. They may involve 3 people, they may involve 3,000 people. But that we have come up with 4 fundamental types of hybrid. And again, we feel that it really is helpful to narrow down what kind of hybrid your meeting is going to be. It can really help to clarify what's going on. So the first kind is where you have a single co-located hub, and you've got lots of Zoomies zooming in, and you've got a facilitator at the hub. And I'll ask you in a moment to tell you which one is most common for you, but that one can often be very common. So you might have 2 or 3 people in head office, and then a few people who are traveling, dialing in is a very simple version of that. The next version is where you have multiple, if you try to move across to the right, you've got multiple hubs. Now, this is very common where you've got, say, country teams. This is very common in my work, where I might have several country teams. They're all co-located in their own offices, but their offices are in different countries. And so they're joining as several hubs. There may be also some Zoomies, and the facilitator is sitting at one of the hubs. Gets more complicated, but all very doable still. All of these are doable, and I've done all of them. The next example, moving down to the bottom left, is a single hub, multiple Zoomies, very like the one above it. However, the difference is that the facilitator isn't in a room with other people. The facilitator is also remote. And I've done that where I've been remote, but also I've had remote producers in different countries as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about the kind of roles you need in order to do that kind of remote conducting of an event, because it's quite challenging as a facilitator. You're flying a little blind. And then finally, bottom right, and predictably, you've got those multiple hubs, multiple Zoomies, and facilitator is also a Zoomie. Big headache, very doable, takes a lot of work to get it right, but it does work. So those are the 4, and I defy you, and I would love to hear if anybody can find a Zoom meeting that doesn't fit into one of those boxes. I'd really be delighted to hear. But what I'm trying to do with those boxes to say, oh, it all seems like a big mess and really complicated, but there are ways of simplifying already by thinking about where are people sitting and what are their needs going to be in those places. The other kind of parameter, if you like, at the bottom is where the balance of roomies and zoomies is radically different, where you've got most people who are co-located in spaces with other people, and then one or two zoomies, or alternatively, you've got most people are zoomies, but you've got a couple of people sharing a laptop somewhere, which is a real drag sometimes. And what can happen is that the balance of that power, if you've got most people are zoomies, you tend to design a zoomie meeting and budge the co-located people at the end. If most people are co-located, you tend to design for a face-to-face meeting, and then you budge the zoomies in at the end. And the problem with that is that it's not good design. What you're not creating is a coherent meeting together. And we'll talk about coherence in a moment. Time for me to shut up for a moment. What I would like you to do is use the annotate tool. And the annotate tool is on your, I've given you a little image there at the bottom right of where you'll find it. At the top of your screen, you've got a green bar. Beside that, there's a menu. Pull down that menu, choose the annotate button, and that will give you a choice of ways you can scribble on this slide. Please tell us which type of hybrid feels most relevant to you, either because that's what you do already or what you think is going to be relevant. So take a moment. If you can't, for any reason, use the annotate tool. If you can't use the annotate tool, then just tell us in the chat. If you're on a Chromebook, you may have problems. Great. Okay. And I'm going to invite you to mute if your microphone is open, just because we can hear a bit of background noise. Oh, great. So we're getting quite a bit of variety already. Okay, let's keep going. And Rhonda has a Chromebook. That's fine. Rhonda, just tell us in the chat which one is most relevant to you, if you like. Okay, mainly upper left-hand corner. Right, so that is, yeah, it's really interesting how common that is. Great. Okay. And for Linda, they're all relevant to Linda. Oh, bless Linda. I'd like to hear a bit more about that in a minute, because that sounds like you possibly do a few different ones. I'd love somebody to open their mic. We can carry on doing that annotation, but I would love someone to open their mic and tell us. And bear in mind, what we're talking about today is hybrid, where we have definitely some remote people and some people who are co-located. So we're not talking about general remote meetings, which is a fairly standard model. Would somebody be willing to raise their hand and tell us about it? Give us an example from one of those boxes. I didn't grab that. I could see your names popping up. Go ahead, Kath. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking I've done a workshop where I've been me in New York, and then I've had some clients in Vevey sitting together in a room, and then some of them were also working from home. So all actually, so some of them were together in person, but there was a general vibe of all of us dialing in, if that makes sense, but in different configurations.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And the person who was sort of in charge of the meeting or chairing it or facilitating it, where were they sitting? Were they co-located?
I guess that was kind of me.
Okay, fair enough. And you were dialing in.
In that I was facilitating it, but because I did feel like I was in charge of the equipment, that felt a little bit stressful for me. So there was a kind of a buddy that I had who was the convener from her end. But I still didn't really feel in control in the way that you might otherwise do. And I think for me, that's a bit of an issue with hybrid, that you're not always in charge of the equipment. You're a bit reliant on other people to be setting things up, and you don't really know what it's going to look or feel like.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Kath. And that is absolutely typical, if you don't mind me saying. It's classic for that bottom left. They all have unique benefits and unique stressors, and the unique stressor there is that flying a bit blind. That's fine, Essen. We'll see you a little bit later. But thank you for that, Kath. And it's really, we'll come back to that point of your buddy, because that's a role and it's a very specific one. And we'll talk a bit more about it. Rhonda, go ahead. You think you might have an example or a question?
Yes, no, just I'm now, the more I think about it, the more I'm thinking of other scenarios, other boxes I could have ticked of the four of them there. And I'm just thinking about like the lower left-hand corner one. I find it's not very often, and it's not even actually that I'm the facilitator, but I find it quite tricky sometimes, because I'll say be here at home and then I'll have a couple of clients together in a room somewhere, maybe some other people joining from other places, and the ones who are together often start chatting amongst themselves as if no one else is there, or maybe they even mute and you can see them talking and you don't know what's going on. And then I've also struggled a bit with the upper right hand corner one. Like I've gone into a client's office to present a debrief, and there'll be a bunch of people in the room, but then there'll also be a load of people who've dialed in from elsewhere who are on the big screen. But then especially once my slides are up on the screen, they all become teeny tiny pictures, and I can't read the room in the broader sense at all. So that's a challenge.
Thank you for sharing that so honestly, Rhonda. And it's funny, one of the things I should say at the beginning is what I don't want you all to leave with your stress levels elevated. I wouldn't mind if you left thinking, oh, I'm going to be very wary before I commit to a hybrid. But bear in mind that there are things that can be done. And Rhonda's example is brilliant, because if I'm right in thinking, Rhonda, you didn't have full control over that meeting. You were kind of guesting, you were presenting at it, but it wasn't up to you to design it. Is that right? Yeah, and that's a very particular case to this particular group, and I think often what you may end up with is having to support your client, just as if you had access issues, you'd be encouraging to sort of put ramps out or whatever, or organize space behind the door. Actually working with your client or whoever is hosting the meeting to make it hostable and get them to think about some of these things beforehand, because almost all of the problems, and we've heard some already and there are loads more, they are all pretty much soluble with the right resources, with a bit of expertise, not necessarily yours or mine, and with some time and thought. And that's often the problem, is these accidental hybrids, is that there isn't time to sort these things out. Thank you for sharing that. What I'm going to do now is invite you to go into breakout room. We'll put you in breakouts in a moment. And let me just clear the annotations. And explain what you're going to be doing in your breakouts. But thank you for that. I've saved it and I can share it. And Linda says she's got a client who's always walking around sittings and taking parts in workshops and meetings with connection and background noise. Yeah, I've had that. I've had people on trains and things. And it's really interesting the levels of behavior one can expect in these sorts of things, particularly if you don't have control over it. That might be one thing and one problem that we can't solve, actually. But let's just tell you what we're going to talk about in breakouts. And it feels to me like you've already got loads to chat about. So use the breakouts however you may wish. Excuse me, I'm just gotten a bit tangled up in my various windows. There we go. Oh, and I've already said, yes, you may not want to use those words. You may want to find others. So what I'd like you to do is you'll be in groups of 3 or 4, roughly. There's no point in saying don't take time to introduce yourselves, because everybody will anyway. So take one breath introductions, and then spend a few minutes exploring, just as we have done, but trying to turn it around, given some of these models that we've identified and some of the stresses and strains we're starting to hear. What would make a great hybrid meeting? Because that basically sets me up to tell you how you can have a great hybrid meeting. So we'll give you 5 minutes. We'll warn you when the time is nearly up. Don't worry if you haven't got examples of this yourself. If you haven't participated in one, or you're not sure you're going to, you will still be able to visualize what it might be like. You may even have done it, particularly during these COVID times. You may have had some accidental hybrids at Christmas time, for example. I know lots of families who had two co-located hubs, and they were trying to talk across Zoom. So it may well be, if you include domestic examples, that you've had loads of experience. So if you've got examples, share them, and we'll bring you back and we'll do a quick Mentimeter. So Lucy, can you count us into the breakouts when you're ready?
Yeah, I'm going to open them now.
Okay, and please remember to watch for the big blue button to join a breakout room if you don't get automatically sent. Okay. Okay. And we have a couple of people who I think have still not managed to pause. Bring them back here. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a useful conversation, an interesting conversation. Feel free to give us a thumbs up from the emoticons list if you found it stimulating. And brilliant. Okay, we've got a few thumbs up. Great, thank you for that. I love the fact that they wave and move around now. Wonderful. So what we're going to do on the basis of those conversations, we're going to just compile a word cloud on this. Some of the exercises I'm doing up to now, we may come back to in the context of how do you pull a hybrid meeting together. So please bear with me if the exercises seem superfluous. They're for a reason. So what I'd like you to do is click on the link in the meeting chat. That will bring you to a Mentimeter for sometimes we call it a Menti. Just type as many words as you think of in regards to important elements of a great hybrid meeting, and make sure that you press the big blue submit button. Okay, and your responses are anonymous, and the other questions aren't relevant. So please jump into Lucy's repasted that in case you hadn't seen it. Please jump in there and we'll give you a moment or two without me disturbing you to answer the questions. Any problems getting in, tell us in chat. Great. Give you a few more moments. Oh, some really nice themes coming out here. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds. Okay, so just bear with me. There's going to be a little bit of a mess while I share this. Right, there we go. So what we're getting, and it will keep updating as people keep adding, which is absolutely fine, but it sometimes can make you a little dizzy, so bear with us. So there's some really nice themes I'm seeing, some of which I'll speak to, some of which I probably won't have time to. But we're seeing, let me find my spotlight. We're seeing things like, and I've lost them again because of change, yes, equal status, parity, and no hierarchy, and participation from all, and equality. And I love that this has come out so early and so obviously, because for me, one of the big issues with hybrid is that often you get the same people who are dialing in remotely into a hub. And so if they're disadvantaged as Zoomies, they're going to be continuously disadvantaged over and over and over. So that's one issue. And secondly, often people can't travel to hubs for certain reasons. It may be disability, it may be caring responsibilities. There's all sorts of reasons why people might not be co-located with the people who are co-located. And it's really important that they're not disadvantaged by that. So I really love that that has come out. And in some ways that means it's not just good practice and sort of elegant to do things like preparation and pre-meeting check-in, but actually that it is part of being fair to people and being professional. So I really like seeing that. We've got a whole load of technical things, which we have finite control over the technology, but there are ways we can gain more control over the technology. And that's partly by planning it and getting the right people in to give us that good tech. And definitely, I love the fact that preparation has come up a few times. We will talk about that in several slides, is about, how might you do that preparation. Does anything pop out? I'd love to hear a couple of your reactions, having seen the whole room's reactions. Anything pop out for any of you that you'd like to draw attention to or share? Feel free to just jump on your mic and tell us.
Actually, I will do. I don't really know.
Thanks, Nicole.
How I would have got round this, but it was a while ago now. I did a live workshop, and there was a dial-in with about 8 people who were all based in Asia. So they are good enough to, with the time difference, they were all starting to get really, really tired. And I'm not sure how you really get around that, but when you deal with different time zones, and that some people should be really having their dinner by now, and other people are, just having their cup of tea in the afternoon. I don't know whether you've got any tips or.
And it's a brilliant point. I think my best tip is to notice that, is to have that in your mind and realize that it's an issue. The solving of it will be very meeting specific and very group specific. But the fact that you've noticed it, that's part of preparation, and that's brilliant. And thinking about how can you mitigate it? Can you have 2 shorter meetings? Can you wiggle it a bit? When I've done that with really with 2 groups with very radically different time zones, and the hub was working in a 3rd zone, we ran some of the meeting asynchronously, in the sense that we didn't have the Zoomies online the whole time, but we gave them some prep to do when they were awake during their daytime, so that they could come in and drop it into the meeting. So we ran a slightly staggered meeting. It was quite complicated, but that worked really well, and they felt really appreciative of it, and they were very appreciative of it. So, but thank you for sharing that. Keep the examples and questions coming. I'm just going to go back now I'm going to move on into a little bit more, if you like, I suppose theory seems a bit too smart, posh a word for it, but just give me a moment to get my slide share up again. I'll say the reason I seem a bit fumbly with slides is that I have a particular way of sharing my slides so that I can see everybody still, and I can see the chat, and I can see all sorts of other bits and bobs, but it always takes a moment or two to get it working. I'm basically sharing a portion of my screen. People, I still hear every so often people saying, "Oh, my slides are covering my screen, so I can't do X, Y, Z." And this is how I get around that problem. And one thing, actually, I think we probably is implicit in back in the Mentimeter, I should say, is that we're assuming great remote meetings as a given. So what we're assuming is a good and well-designed face-to-face meeting in the hub, a good, well-designed remote meeting, that they're all possible. And what we're trying to do is create an amazing holistic experience across both. Because what I'm often hear in discussions of hybrid are things that relate to any kind of remote meeting or any kind of meeting, and that's always going to be a bit of an issue. Okay, so let's talk about, I call what we're trying to do in hybrid, the jargon I use as a facilitator is practical and experiential aims. And don't worry about the jargon, you'll be familiar with this already. So the practical aims are the very tangible outputs, outcomes, or decisions or products from whatever gathering you're going to. And they're always, we're professionals here, and we're talking about almost entirely professional environments. And we're often very good at being very clear about that. So we might ask in the planning of our event, what do we need to accomplish? What will be produced? We might already have an agenda, which works as a tick list for things we want to do. We might be agreeing actions or coming to a consensus decision on something, or deepening our understanding of an issue and coming up with solutions. And they all are very, very tangible. We're often quite good at designing meetings to achieve those, but what often we neglect, particularly in professional environments, is how we want a group to feel or to be during and after the process. And so in order to elicit those experiential aims, you might say, well, what do you want the group to experience? How do you want them to feel about it after it's over? And often the answers to those are quite common across meetings. You want people to feel included and heard. You want them to feel some ownership and commitment to decisions, for example, or you might want them to feel part of a team or a group. And our arguments as facilitators is that any gathering needs to be designed for both its practical and its experiential aims, and that a really great gathering will hold both of those and design to both of those. And it doesn't need to be big design. If it's only a phone call between 5 or 6 people, with two Zoomies and 4 roomies, you may not need a big elaborate design, but you still need to think about how will people feel included and heard, and how will you design to that? What's the ways and the tools you might use to do that? So I'm just going to move on because I've spent a bit too much time chatting earlier on. So I'm going to move on a little bit faster here. But my argument, or our argument, I suppose, with my team now, that in relation to hybrid events, they inherit all the aims, the practical aims of your meetings, all the experiential aims of your other meetings, but they bring 2 other challenges. One is coherence. And that is the extent to which everybody can contribute to and receive all the parts of the event. When I mean parts, I mean the slides, the voices, the images, the notes, the flip charts, anything that is part of the product of the meeting. And that's particularly an issue if you're going to have verbal and written contributions from lots of people in the space, as opposed to, say, just keynote speakers or panels. With keynote speakers, generally, you want people to be able to see slides and hear them. But if it's much more workshop-based, you really want people to be able to see and contribute to flip charts and things like that. The connection challenge, the experiential challenge specific to hybrid, is the extent to which actually people can connect with each other in the space, in the room or in the space. And that's with everybody in general. And so, for instance, a lot of you have done that already. You've posted in the chat, you've opened your mic, you've spoken in breakouts, you've already started to connect. And that connection feels stronger and deeper if you get a chance to do it in a small group. And to me, the real gold dust in a great hybrid event is if people have a chance to be in small groups with each other, with some others, and if those small groups mix the roomies and the Zoomies together. Really mind-bendingly challenging sometimes, but it is where the real connection gold happens if it goes well. Let me, I can give you some examples, but I'd like to hear your reaction to that first. Does that make sense to you all? Does anybody want to go ahead? Did somebody open their mic there? Okay, I'm not seeing any hand raises, so I'll carry on and let you digest that. Sometimes it becomes clearer with examples of how you would do it. So creating coherence. Remember, this is the practical aim of getting all the parts of the meeting. You want to make sure that everybody can hear each other's contributions, that they can see each other's text, and you might want to use a tool with which to do that. Other ways you can share the other parts are things like breakouts from shared reporting from the breakouts. You might want to do, again, things like Mentimeter or Jamboard to share that thinking. And then there are lots of other methods that you can use, facilitation methods that you can bring into a hybrid world to make it easier for everybody to get all parts of the meeting. Moving on to connection, and some methods are dependent on the size of the event. Kath, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. What is World Cafe? Because I've seen that and I just intrigued.
World Cafe is a facilitation method where the groups sit around tables or sit in a space, and they have their discussion, but then one person stays on the table or room and everybody else moves on, and another group comes and they hear what the first group were thinking about. So what you're doing is you're building responses to the questions, and people are hearing each other's responses by having sort of rapporteurs sitting at a table. So that's a very quick and crude response. I've realized the time is galloping away from us, so I'm going to skip over a couple of slides. You will get the deck afterwards anyway. But so creating connection, you need people to be able to see. You need to be able to facilitate people to connect with each other. Often you'll do games and energizers. We didn't do one today because we didn't have very long, but games and energizers, a classic way of building connection. You'll see that all of these things are things we might do in ordinary meetings. Mixed breakouts really help to create that sense of being human, meeting other humans rather than a batch of pictures. And then another way is thinking about working asynchronously and doing really rich introductions. I worked with a group, the public engagement group in Wales, and they ran a Padlet for a day before the meeting, where people answered quite detailed questions about their work and where they were and their favorite place. And so we got a beautiful collage of introductions before people ever turned up to the event. So there's all sorts of things you can do asynchronously to start building that connection. Loads of tools that you can use to connect hybrid, to connect the different elements of hybrid together. What my encouragement, I'm not going to get into particular examples because there are as many examples as there are individuals, but what I would encourage you to do is, if you're going to be designing these sorts of events, have a palette and stick with the palette. You don't need a million different tools, but it's really good to have a range of them for different activities. I'm going to move on beyond whiteboards, and I'm just going to say something about scripts. I'd love to hear, let's use the yes/no button on your reactions. I'd love to hear, do you use a script if you're running a meeting? And by a script, I don't mean a kind of a verbatim script, but more something a bit more like a theatre script, which is, go lights, or go the Mentimeter, or go the breakouts. So that kind of timetabled script. Do any of you use it? I'm hearing some yeses. Okay, Rhonda's had to go. Bye, Rhonda. So I'm hearing some yeses and nos. One of the things that is crucial in the preparation for hybrid is to have a really detailed script that everybody who's involved in delivering it can use. Otherwise, and that is even for just an hour's meeting. In fact, for this remote meeting, Lucy and I had a script so that she knew exactly what was in my head, and it was really clear who was doing what. And that's how you make these things move smoothly. And then the final thing is technology. And it's interesting because often, and I haven't heard it so much from you folk, but often when we start talking about hybrid, people immediately start talking about the technology. And actually, my recommendation is you try and design your meeting first and then make the technology serve you as well as you can. I appreciate that often you're stuck with the technology in particular rooms and conference spaces and things like that. But essentially, somebody needs to go through a checklist and consider, how is there communication? Where are the microphones? Where are the speakers? Is there the capacity for connection? Are there cameras and are there displays? And what are the collaboration tools and technology going to be if there is going to be some writing down or brainstorming or note-taking or slide sharing. And that's your checklist. And then it can be everything from a whole load of mobile phones right through to all singing and all dancing conference suites. And that sometimes surprises people because they feel that the technology is really, really hard in hybrid. It doesn't have to be. And I've specified there, the one thing to think about in the technology, breaking it down into seeing and hearing, and working, and then thinking about upload of material and download of material. So if you want to be seen, you need to be projected. And if you're being projected, somebody at the other end needs to see you. So I often think of it like a river of kind of different kinds of information flowing around. You need to think about where are the bridges and the weirs. I draw it. I haven't got an example with me, I'm afraid, but I ran a very last minute hybrid a few weeks ago, and I actually drew all the different machines, all the different phones, all the different cables, and I drew it out like that. Checking the tech at places that you don't have access to, which is Lucy's question. I try and make contact with the person who can check it and get them to send me photos of the setup and actually try and do a virtual walkthrough. And somebody mentioned in the Mentimeter about a pre-meet for a check-in. And at that point, you can do the tech check. So ideally, that's how it would work, or make somebody else responsible for doing it. I'm going to pause in a minute. I'm just going to give you some questions to consider. And actually, that this is the end of today's session. Things to think about if you're involved in commissioning, or even if you've got some influence on a meeting, is think about, might it be better to run completely remotely? Really, why are you doing hybrid? And is there a good reason for it, given that it takes easily 2 to 3 times as long to prepare and run a really good one as it does to run a face-to-face event or a remote event? Think about where the center of energy is and how you're going to mitigate it. Think about how you're going to manage the power and the share of voice, which you all mentioned, lots of you mentioned earlier on. Identify and then design to the practical and the experiential aims. And we haven't talked about this very much, but ensure that there are enough people available to resource it adequately. Think about whether it has to all be synchronous or whether you could have touch points, and that helps you resolve, I think it was Nicola's question about time zones. And make the invitation very clear to people. Are people going to be invited to watch or to listen or to participate? And make that really, really clear and feasible for them to do those things. I know I galloped through a lot of that and threw a lot of at you, but I'm going to pause now and have a bit of a free flow. I encourage you to raise your hands. I'd love to hear what more questions you have or insights you have. Nath, go ahead.
Sorry. You mentioned how much longer it takes to organise a hybrid meeting.
Mm-hmm.
You managed to convey that to clients and charge accordingly?
That's a great question. I put in my terms and conditions, if there's a meeting or meetings or events as part of my quote, I will say this is premised on it being remote, or this is premised on it being face-to-face. If you want this to be hybrid, you need to discuss this with me, and it will cost extra. And so I make it really upfront, so I don't have people just throwing people in as a dial-in. And so that's the way I do it. And then I sit down and explain to them how difficult it is and how expensive it is to do it well. And often they decide to go with just a normal remote meeting. Just on that note, you wouldn't necessarily have all these people for a small event, but for a big event, you're going to have somebody who's in charge of the event, a producer, ideally one for Zoom, and then one for your whiteboard if you're using Miro or Mural. We didn't talk about that very much, but we're big fans of using Miro or Mural to stitch the hybrid meeting together. A runner, who I think Kath mentioned earlier on, so some sort of liaison, so that it's really clear what's happening between the different spaces in the meeting. And then you've got your speakers, your chairs, your experts, all of those people as well. So it's a lot of moving parts, potentially. You don't have to have one person for each of those roles, but you need to be clear who is going to take it into their portfolio. Okay, any other questions or insights indeed? Go ahead, Danny.
Hi, Orla. Thanks for that. It was brilliant. I had one question about when you mentioned providing tripods for people's smartphones who are present in the room, for the roomies.
Mm-hmm.
How doable is it to get people who are present in the room also present on the Zoom call, so that, you know, to facilitate breakout rooms? I'm not even sure if it's
absolutely, yeah. A great question for that. You probably need to come on our course, but you can do it by having Zoom enabled laptops in the breakout spaces. Is one way to do it. We very rarely let everybody, we actually almost never let everybody in the room log on to Zoom. What we'll do is we'll log the hub or hubs onto Zoom and project the Zoom space. And then for breakouts, we'll have physical breakout spaces and Zoom breakout spaces, and they will map onto each other via usually one laptop. I can give you a much longer answer to that, which will make it clearer. Okay.
That clarifies that.
Yeah, absolutely possible. Just takes time, laptops, cables, and space. And actually a couple of good runners as well. I noticed that people are starting to run away. I'm happy to stay. Let me just go to my final slides. I mentioned this to Danny already, and I have permission from Lucy to mention this. We do teach this over 3 2-hour sessions. We give you, in the masterclass, we give you a chance to actually design your own meeting. So that's particularly relevant to those who host workshops and things like that. And then we also have a short 2-hour boot camp, which covers a bit more material than I've covered today, but gives you a chance to think about how might it be if you're turning up to some of these spaces. So do feel free. There is an ICG discount of 15% with that little code of tiny writing at the bottom of that slide. So I'll stop sharing, and we have 4 minutes left. Lucy, did you need to say anything else to people, or shall we just let people free with?
Yeah, are there any questions?
I know I've thrown an awful lot at you. I mean, I'll talk while we're waiting for you to come up with questions. I would say don't be afraid of hybrid, because it's amazing to be able to connect people across the globe, you know, in that way. And people have found it really moving and really worthwhile when it's been done well. And it's enabled them to do something that otherwise they could not have done. And so, you know, let's be respectful of the fact that it's challenging, but let's not be scared off it completely. Let's just do our best to do it well. Go ahead, Judith.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you, because it's well, a couple of things. First of all, it's great to know that you're not the only one who thinks it can be a bit of a nightmare. But on the other hand, I was going to endorse what you were saying about you know, the fact that we can do it, and we can see people all around the world, not just sort of saving on travel and all that, but I just had, you know, years of nightmare teleconferences where you couldn't even see, you know, somebody's head across the room. You didn't know if they were even still in the room, you know, because they'd be on mute. And so I think it's an amazing opportunity, just you know, but just like you said, having the sort of the thinking up front and the ways to tackle the technology, so you get on top of it rather than letting it, you know, win.
Exactly, and not letting the technology tail wag the dog, because just because you have a conference-enabled space doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do that. It might just be just as easy to have people on their own laptop somewhere. So absolutely, and really that design, really getting people to try and design it and think it through first, and then plug the technology in. Judith, thanks. So thanks, Judith. Sorry, Nicole, sorry. Nicole.
Apologies if you've already covered this, but what would you say would be a maximum length of running a hybrid meeting? in terms of like, you know, physical hours, because if you're live, you can just run a much longer meeting than you can if you're just on Zoom. Because people it's just too much for people.
It's a really good point, actually, and I hadn't covered it. I suppose it's sort of tenuously covered it. We talked about time zones, but I would never ask people to be working remotely for more than 2.5 hours in a day.
I agree. And I think that's the downside of it.
Yeah. And so then, yes, then it gets really messy. If you're looking at a 1 or 2 day workshop, you cannot have people online for 1 or 2 days dialing in remotely. So then that's where letting them go away and do some sort of asynchronous activity by themselves, or potentially looking at whether you could have them on the phone for a while, doing a walk and talk or something like that. So there are ways in between being there and being not there. There are other things that you might be able to get them to do, but it's a really important point. And that's
I'm
why,
reassured that you've said that number, because that's what I've had in my head.
Yeah. If you're American, you can actually, in America, there's quite a brutal culture there, and so actually people are often kept for 3 or more hours, but not in Europe. I know people have 12 o'clock, so that's fine. I'm happy to shoot the breeze for a few more minutes, but what we'll probably do, it's just coming up to the dot of the hour, so I think I might invite Lucy to turn the recording off, and then I'm glad you enjoyed it. We will send you out an evaluation. Please, I'd love to get some feedback